all. This is Dr. Mobeen Sayed from drbeen.com. Welcome to one more show. So today with us, we have Dr. Stein. She is a psychiatrist and has been suffering herself with chronic fatigue syndrome and now is helping patients with that. So Dr. Stein, welcome.
Thank you.
So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so my story, I think, is very similar potentially to many of yours. I was 25, just starting my psychiatry training. I was in second year. I had been healthy, active, playing sports, traveling, doing all the things that many of us aspire to do. And I got a pretty mild flu-like illness. Didn't think much of it, but I never recovered. And the next 27 years were extremely challenging, to put it mildly, feeling all of the typical symptoms of ME CFS, the fatigue, the post-exertional malaise, the unrefreshing sleep, the body aches and pains from fibromyalgia. I became super chemically sensitive, very sensitive to many foods. I developed POTS, so orthostatic intolerance, and passed out once in the OR as a intern. That was not appreciated very much by the preceptor, the orthopedic surgeon. So I went through all of that, and this was in 1989. ME CFS was only defined in 1988. So there was literally nobody around who knew anything. And after about 10 years of really struggling every single day, I finally met a fellow physician who also had the illness and who was a little bit further ahead of me in her research. What she taught me was self-management. And that was what really helped me get to the place where I could live with a little bit more ease. But it wasn't until 2017, so just 7 years ago, that things really shifted for me. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about what I think might have made the difference. But in general, it was that really, and I'm still very dedicated to self-management every single day. The basics like pacing, eating, sleeping, etc. I changed my diet in a way that it was better for me. I wouldn't say it's the right diet for everyone. I use things like red light therapy. I use things like neuroplasticity-based practices every day. And I think the combination of all of those things took care of enough of whatever was going on in my body that my body's innate healing kind of just clicked in. And for the last 7 years, I've been a lot better, a lot more functional.
Congratulations for that you are
Thank you.
feeling better, and thank you very much for sharing this with others as well. A quick note for the audience here, for the cool beans. I have no strings attached. I'm going to show you Dr. Stein's website as well. You would see one of the pages that they created for Dr. Bean as well. However, I have no commission in any of the products, free or not free. So please be aware that there are no strings attached. Dr. Stein, if you don't mind, I'm going to quickly show your website. So this is Eleanor Stein MD.ca, Canada. And that is the pathways here. And this is a landing page. Both of these links are present in the description of this video. This is a landing page that shows my logo as well. So thank you for your interest in long COVID as presented in Dr. Bean's podcast. And then you can have various pathways or protocols by Dr. Stein. This is drbeen.com, so that is also important to show this to you. So with this, once again, Dr. Stein, thank you very much for being here. One question that I'm going to put forth to you, that once we had Raylan, so the history that you are here, we have Alexander, who is one of the cool beans. He connected me to Raylan, then Raylan connected me to you. So credit goes to Alexander and Raylan. Raylan, when she joined us on this channel, she talked about mind, body, and mindfulness. And many of the my audience members, we are very deeply medical oriented and mechanism oriented. And so they said, well, this is not a biological function, mindfulness and mind body connection. So tell me this, what is the role of the mindfulness or meditation or mind body connection in healing this chronic situation?
What I would say about that is it's not mindfulness or meditation per se, like those are mind body tools. What I'm constantly learning all the time, and my paradigm for what causes what we now call this umbrella term of complex chronic disease. So things like myalgic encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, perhaps chronic Lyme disease, perhaps long COVID, for example, all fit in this category. One of the pieces of research that I think really makes sense to me is by Dr. Robert Navio. He's at Stanford, and he's come up with a concept called the cell danger response, predominantly based on metabolomics and I would say an encyclopedic knowledge of biochemistry. So he's hardcore scientist. In brief, the cell danger response is the cells experience a stressor. What's really interesting about his hypothesis is that he says the stressor could be anything, right? The cell actually can't tell a difference between a physical or a psychological or an infectious or a temperature or a lack of sleep stressor, just to name a few. So the mitochondria in the cell notice a change in redox in the oxidative reduction balance. And if it's unfavorable, the mitochondria shut down into a hibernation-like state, which means that the cells don't have enough energy. Now, he explains that this is evolutionarily conserved and present in all, I'll say, animals. I think it might be something similar in plants, but I can't say for sure. So we'll say animals. And it happens every day. So every day in many cells in the body, they're shutting down for a while. And then when the resources they need to function are replenished, they go back online. And he calls this process of going back online the healing cycle. And he has this very detailed biochemical kind of pathways, 3 steps that the cells have to go through to go from the cell danger response, where energy production is shut down as a self-preserving strategy, to the healing cycle. And he talks about, like for a hardcore scientist, it's really interesting. He talks about how the cell, he kind of anthropomorphizes the cells, and he says the cells have to feel and be safe. His first paper came out on this in 2014, so it's 10 years now, and I've been reading his work, carefully that this whole time. And I think what he's saying makes sense. So the cells have to actually be safe, meaning anything that's maybe a cause of chronic inflammation has to be dealt with. And they also have to feel safe. And so if we're constantly depriving them of what they need, they're going to be kind of on tenterhooks. So where I think some of the mind-body strategies come in is to help us as an organism feel safe and to regulate the central nervous system. So the research
Understood.
on meditation is super strong, right? That it helps tip that balance between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system, the amygdala. So when we're under stress, the fight or flight takes over, the amygdala is overactive, and it's like a seesaw. When that happens, the prefrontal cortex, our thinking center, gets shut down. And what my understanding of meditation is that it kind of shifts that balance so that we can act more in our own best interest.
Understood. Thank you very much. So, tell me, in these chronic inflammatory states, for example, CFS or fibromyalgia, or nowadays long COVID, maybe some
Mhm.
vaccine side effects as well. What is going on in the patient's body, and how do they begin to think about coming out of it? I get so many friends, patients, not my patients, I don't practice here in the US, but patients who call me and they say that we are unable to move, we are bedridden, our bodies are aching. How do they approach this?
Well, again, I feel like Dr. Navio's hypothesis really speaks to this. Some stressor happens, and again, it could be a wide range of stressors, but viruses or infections are certainly prominent amongst the list. And the cell goes into this cell danger response where it's not producing enough energy. So that causes all of the symptoms. It causes the fatigue. It causes post-exertional malaise because the energy, there's not as much to start with. And when we do an activity, it gets used up faster. And then it takes longer to replenish because oxidative phosphorylation, which makes more ATP, is shut down. And we're relying on glycolysis. It causes, I think, the autonomic symptoms because there's just not enough energy for the arteries to push the blood up to the brain. I think it causes a lot of the digestive problems because, again, digestion uses energy. It causes brain fog because the brain uses 20% of the body's energy. So if you kind of go through symptom by symptom, the most common symptoms of, say, ME and long COVID, they can mostly be explained by this lack of energy. But then you have to ask, well, why is the body stuck, if this is even true? But there's been, other researchers have done collaborating research, so it's not just one person. But if this is true, why is the body stuck and why isn't it righting itself or coming back to balance? And I think that question and how to get unstuck is what's going to kind of open this field.
Understood. So then tell me, you said 7 years ago you started feeling better. I'm hoping that the listeners of the talk today, they have some action items to think about. How was your journey in terms of a patient who was trying to get out of it? And what was it that helped? And what is your suggestion other than people becoming your members and looking at the pathways
Yeah.
and what is your suggestion for them to begin to even think about it?
What I've come to through my own 36 years struggling with ME and FM and MCS and POTS, I've gone through kind of full cycle. So at the very beginning, self-management was what allowed me to survive. I've worked part-time throughout my career. So at that time, I was never well enough to work full-time, but it kept me in the game. And of course, as soon as I was well enough, I started traveling to all these conferences, trying to learn as much as I could from alternative strategies, functional medicine, environmental medicine. Like literally, I was starving for information. And I tried literally hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of tests and protocols. None of them really worked for me over the long term. Like I'd have a few months where I think, oh my gosh, this is it. I'm feeling better. And then I just slide back down. And I know from the thousands of patients I worked with, because I then specialized my medical practice in these conditions for the last 25 years, that they mostly have the same experience. And so what I've really come to, for me, time I got better, I was doing not a single protocol or fancy supplement. I was carefully pacing. I was doing things every single day to optimize my sleep so that I would wake up more refreshed. Like I said, I had made a diet change. Now, for me personally, the autoimmune protocol diet, it's called the AIP. It's a very restrictive diet that I do not recommend for most people. I would recommend trying it if you've tried everything else, which I pretty much had, or if you have an autoimmune disease. Like I said, I was using red and infrared light therapy, and that's a really cool treatment. I don't know, Dr. Mobeen, if you've had other guests on your podcast talking about it. Like, are your listeners familiar with light and red and infrared light?
We have discussed infrared lights in detail.
Okay.
And I believe that my audience has a very good understanding, or at least the educational material
Sure.
available for how this all works, even how it affects mitochondria.
Perfect. So really quickly, for maybe the people who aren't as familiar, the red and infrared light is specifically absorbed by the cytochrome C and the mitochondria. It's basically like free energy. It provides the photons, activate that enzyme and allow it to produce more ATP. And because I feel, and the research is strongly suggesting, that both ME and long COVID are disorders of inadequate energy, when I heard about this, I was like, why did we not learn this in medical school? I immediately went to Toronto, did the training, bought a fancy system, and started using it on myself and my patients. And, you know, I'm quite happy with the results. I'm actually traveling, so you can see my background. I'm traveling around North America, going to beautiful places, and I have my red and infrared light therapy machine in the back of my van. I couldn't
That
bring
is
my sauna, but I could bring that.
That is so interesting. And I have actually done this discussion that sauna has a different way of helping by activating the heat shock proteins, which then help
Yeah.
clean up the cells. And near infrared, kickstarting the mitochondrial electron transport chain, especially the cytochrome C and the complex 4, that releases nitric oxide and that causes vasodilatation. These are very interesting mechanisms. I'm so glad to hear from you that you're using it. So, what else?
I'll just say maybe the bad news. So in my experience, brain fog, which is the symptom, which is disabling, like 85% or more of people with ME and long COVID have brain fog, to the extent that it can be disabling and can be the single thing that prevents people from working. I have not come across a direct strategy to improve brain fog. But what I have found is that if people carefully pace, so maybe I could spend a couple minutes on pacing because it's so central.
Absolutely.
So pacing means adjusting your daily activities to the amount of energy you have and working to prevent crashes. So anybody with these disorders knows exactly what a crash is. You do some modest activity, could be physical, could be mental, could be emotional, and you have like an overreaction of the body, right? That most people, or you yourself before you became ill, you would do that activity with ease. And now it causes you to be extremely fatigued and all of your other symptoms to flare. So it's not just fatigue, it's like everything gets worse. So what has been shown in research by Leonard Jason's group at DePaul University in Chicago very, very clearly is that if people stay within what we call the energy envelope, and I kind of use the metaphor of dollars. So say you wake up in the morning, $100 would be perfect health, kind of equivalent to 100%. $50 is you're just on the border of between moderate and severe illness. $30, you're mostly couch or bed bound. So depending on how many dollars you have when you wake up, the goal of pacing is not to spend all your dollars, to keep a couple dollars in the bank, just like a credit card, to build up a reserve fund. Now, sometimes you have to do something that's outside of your capacity. Our credit card is adrenaline, right? So we can draw on it if we need it. It gets us through the situation, but there's a cost. We've used up every last molecule of ATP. And then we have to pay back. And if we do that too often, interest starts accruing. This is a very rough metaphor. So what I recommend to people, self-awareness is a big part of what I think is very helpful. If I look back at the people I've worked with who have done the best over the years, they're the people who have really paid attention to each of their major symptoms, what makes them better, what makes them worse. So when it comes to pacing, the key is to know which activities, how much each activity costs you in terms of energy dollars, and to try to stay within your budget.
Understood. So, in the context of pacing, I have another question. I taught a study a few months ago where the presenters, and am I good? So my internet keeps going down, so I'm kind of a little nervous about it.
Okay.
So the presenters had said that the people of long-term inflammation with the muscular issues, fatigue, for example, they actually start having phenotypes of their muscle fibers to start changing. And they
Mhm.
had said that for such people, in rigorous exercises can actually be harmful instead of beneficial. And they
Yeah.
said slow moving, gliding exercises will be useful. My question to you is, have you come across this kind of activity, yoga or others, that are also helpful? Or in terms of exercises, what is the suggestion for
Like what type
individuals?
of exercise? So I'll start by saying it's incredibly individual, and it really depends on how many energy dollars you wake up with. So if you're mildly affected, meaning you're waking up with about 70% of your previous energy, you can do what would I say, like not vigorous exercise, but say moderate exercise. Um, Things like walking, maybe light swimming, things like that. If you are a person who's functioning in the moderate range, say 50 to 70% of your previous energy, you have to be extremely careful because any type of exercise is going to be draining and could potentially cause a crash. If you're functioning with below 50% of your previous energy, then I tell people don't do any intentional exercise. The amount of activity that you're going to have to do just to live, like to walk to the toilet, to cook, to shop, whatever it is that you need to do to think, is going to take all of the energy that you have. So the answer to that question is extremely dependent on illness severity. If you
Understood.
have so many, just to answer specifically about things like yoga, many of my patients over the years tried yoga, even restorative yoga, and found that that was even too heavy for them and they would crash. There's a woman in St. Catharines, Ontario, who I just met. Her company is called Nourish Yoga. Her name's Shannon Williams, and I just talked with her a few weeks ago. The video is, I think it's up on my website, or it will be very shortly for free. And she has, through her own illness experience and yoga training, has kind of developed a very, very gentle yoga approach. So for people that are, I'm going to say even 60% and below, you have to be extremely careful, and something like this very gentle yoga may be appropriate.
Understood. Thank you very much. So, if you have some time, some more time, I
Hmm.
would like to take some of the questions and look at some of the comments on the community
Sure.
from the Cool
Hmm.
Beans. One of the comments that rolled up, it was from Margaret. The comment was, or the question was, let me see if I can actually put it up. Here it is. So, Margaret McInnes says, can MECFS cause paralysis?
I think so. It's very rare to be totally paralyzed, and it's usually maybe certain body parts and coming and going. I haven't really been able to understand whether it's due to just sheer lack of energy, like you just can't move that body part. I had one young patient who we finally figured out she had hypokalemic periodic paralysis. You know, that was like a big day where we figured that out, because then she started taking potassium and, you know, felt dramatically better and could do way more. So one of the things I always warn my patients and physicians who I talk to about ME, and now I could say the same thing about long COVID, is that not everything you experience is due to those illnesses. So the illnesses cause a lot, but like in the case of this patient who had low potassium, you know, if we hadn't figured that out, she wouldn't have gotten better.
Understood. Thank you very much. Just a quick note. I see a comment from someone in the audience here. Um, this is just my commentary. Long
Hmm.
COVID is not necessarily vaccine injured. And every vaccine injury doesn't mean long COVID. Long COVID is a disease of its own that was
Mhm.
present before even the vaccines were being given. So we need to make sure that we do not start labeling everyone who is long COVID to say they must be vaccine injured. Not only it kind of dilutes the problem, it actually causes dismissal of the people who had COVID and then developed long COVID. So I just want to make sure that we correct our
Okay.
terminologies. Now, with this, I have another question over here that was the near infrared. So there was a question about the wavelength of the near infrared. So I think, Dr. Stein, near infrared, the correct wavelength, whatever it is, that is the lamp to be used, correct?
Yeah, there's a bit of a range. I believe my system is 830 nanometers wavelength, and the usual red wavelength, because the red and the infrared actually work almost identically, and the red is usually around 640 nanometers. What I've heard is that the infrared can maybe penetrate a little bit more deeply. So the protocol that I use is actually on the neck. It's actually a protocol that was developed for people with headaches. And the reason I think it works as a whole body treatment is because all of the blood and the lymph passes through the neck, gets energized, and then is distributed to the whole body. So there's a couple ways to use red and infrared. One is to just put them on the body part, like say I wake up with, my shoulders out or something like that. I just put it on that body part. Extremely helpful. Usually within a couple hours, I forgot that I even woke up that way. But for ME/CFS and long COVID, I would recommend using it on the neck or the head, because that's going to activate the blood that's then going to travel to the whole body. And if you're doing transcranial, so there's research at, I believe it's Harvard, Dr. Tsai, and she's doing research on uh, different, actually, I think I just got confused. So she's actually doing research on pulsed light and pulsed sound at 40 hertz for dementia. So, of course, as soon as I read that research 10 years ago, I set my machine to pulse at 40 hertz. So I'm using red and infrared light at that frequency. Most people are just using LED panels, right? And for most people, those are powerful enough to see a difference. You don't have to have a fancy programmable system.
Understood. And before I ask you more questions, I want to once again kind of familiarize our audience here. This is the website for Dr. Stein. This is Eleanor Stein MD keep saying California because I live here .ca Canada, and pathways. The link is in the description. There is actually a cool landing page for my name as well over here. However, I want to make sure that I disclaim this or clarify this, that I have no commercial interest or no strings attached in all of this. That is just very kind of Dr. Stein to have a landing page with my name as well. Please take advantage of this. Now, back to you, Dr. Stein. I have another question that I just saw over here.
Can
That
before you ask it, can I just say, if you go to the link that has Dr. Bean's name in it, you're going to come to this landing page and you're going to get a free handout. So I about a year ago, I made a handout of what do I think are the most important strategies for people with long COVID and ME to kind of consider, and that's in the handout. And it includes some of the things that I've mentioned. So it includes careful self-awareness as being the starting point for anything. Because if you don't clearly know what's going on, you're not going to be able to fix it. Second, I talk about mindset, because there's some very convincing hardcore biological research showing how having our mindset optimistic and aligned with our goals can make changes in our biology. I think the third thing I have in there is pacing, which I've just mentioned. I think I mentioned sleep. Sleep is so important. If I could just say a word on that. So, probably the single most helpful thing And what I learned is recently that all of the sleep strategies that people teach in cognitive behavior therapy for insomnia um, actually rely on neuroplasticity. So what happens with insomnia is our brain gets into this habit of equating nighttime as a time to be restless and wake up and not sleep deeply. And CBTI is actually a way of retraining the brain that bed and night is a time to sleep. I can't remember the fifth tip I have on there. You'll have to click on the handout.
Absolutely. So I would let the
Yeah,
audience click
sorry.
and no worries.
Mhm.
So very good. Thank you very much. I believe sleep is a hugely important thing as well. Some more questions. Jennifer says, would antivirals like Maraviroc or Valsite work? Nicotine?
Yes. So, I can talk about Valsite because I've been in the field a long time and I've had I'm a psychiatrist, so I didn't prescribe it myself, but I worked with many family doctors and shared with them protocols which came from Silicon Valley, actually, from the original doctors who did that work were at Stanford. What I found is that, so Valsite and valacyclovir and valganecyclovir are usually used to try to lower down reactivated human herpes viruses. And the problem with human herpes viruses is they never go away. So the best you can do is kind of suppress them temporarily. So what I found is some people would have no benefit whatsoever. Some people would have benefit, but it rarely lasted very long. But I did find them safe, and I didn't have any patients who had, very severe reactions. I can't comment on nicotine. I Maybe the person's wondering because it's a little bit energizing. Do you think that's behind the question? I'm not
Maybe.
sure. I don't have experience with it, so I'm not
No
going to
worries.
speculate. And the Maraviroc, I don't know enough about. Like I've been reading about it, but I don't have any personal experience.
So we have discussed Maraviroc a bit. Dr. Bruce
Mhm.
Patterson's protocol has Maraviroc and statins. So that is also a very interesting drug. And there are many long COVID patients who have benefited greatly from Maraviroc. And there are some who have said that, hey, it didn't help at all. So I think there is a spectrum like any other medicine as well. I have a
Mm,
question for you
sure.
before I ask other cool bean questions.
Yeah.
And that question is, what is the overlap that you see with ME/CFS and long COVID like symptoms? Is there 100% overlap or there are some differences as well that you observe?
Um, there is definitely not 100% overlap. So I have a blog, I believe it was November 2022, where I have a chart and I actually go through symptom by symptom, how many people with this symptom, with this disease have the symptom. So for example, for fatigue and long COVID, it's 80%, whereas in ME/CFS, it's 100%. 66% of people, this is from the Davis paper, 66% of people with long COVID have a cough. Most people with ME/CFS don't have a cough, for example. So they're definitely not identical, but the core symptoms of fatigue, post-exertional malaise, brain fog, muscle aches and pains, and unrefreshing sleep, and the autonomic symptoms are very similar to both.
Makes sense. And I think if I add that patients who are suffering from vaccine side effects, their tinnitus is very
Mhm.
common,
Interesting.
especially with the adenovirus based vaccines. So, some more questions for you. There is a question from Shadowman. Ivermectin 12 mg seems to help the worst symptoms, especially during or after COVID. Are you game to mention it, Dr. Bean? So I have talked about ivermectin many times. So I don't think this challenge is even worth. I have done 62 videos about ivermectin. Okay,
Wow.
so continuing on, Mball has a question. Gut bacteria changes. Would that help?
Yes. Oh, I see, to like a fecal transplant or something like that. So interestingly enough, in 1999, I was living in Australia. So that's 25 years ago. And I met a physician there, a gastroenterologist, who way back then was doing fecal transplants for kids with autism and for adults with ME CFS. And I got to go to his clinic and, sit in. He gave me free rein. I could talk to everyone who was there, how it had helped them. And it seemed quite impressive. More recently, so we know that there's microbiome changes, absolutely for sure, in ME/CFS. Several studies now are showing that, and specifically the butyrate producing species are low. I think that's called like Preswicki. That the species name is a bit hard to pronounce, Preswicki, something like that. So it's very low, and therefore there's low butyrate, and that low butyrate correlates with the fatigue, so it seems relevant. There was a Norwegian study on fecal transplant that was extremely disappointing. So things are kind of in a holding pattern at the moment. My thought, and I've done a lot of reading about the microbiome, and I'm aware how easy and fast it is to change the microbiome by changing diet. Now, the one proviso, so that's my approach, right? Everything I haven't said it explicitly, but after I tried all that fancy stuff myself, I've kind of come back to self-management because it's relatively easy, relatively inexpensive, and it puts the power back in our hands. But just to say about the microbiome, like we can change our microbiome within 2 days of a diet change. The only time this isn't going to work, and I just learned this in the last week, is that sometimes the bacteria have gone extinct. Like if we've been eating a really poor junk food diet for a long time, the beneficial bacteria have actually left our body. And now if we improve our diet, we can make some gains, but not kind of totally restore the healthy microbiome that we might have had at one time. So and I've also found for me personally and my patients, probiotics, they were not the be all and end all, and they're very expensive. So I would rather have people spend any money they have to spare on this towards a healthy diet, which means real food. I think actually that was the 5th tip in my handout. Real food, not things in packages, cans, or like with barcodes. As many different colorful fruits and vegetables as possible because of the phytonutrients that not only give our body the nutrition it needs, but are also a hormetic stress. So they stress our cells just enough and in the right ways to activate those healing properties that our body possesses. I'm getting very interested in hormesis and what can we do in our everyday life that's no to low cost that activates our body's own capacity to heal.
Understood. Thank you very much. And so the food and histamine, is there
Hmm.
any relationship that you have seen of histamine with chronic fatigue like syndromes, or it is just a science that is still need to be proved?
That's a tricky one. So what I didn't say, another complex chronic disease probably in that umbrella is MCAS, mast cell activation syndrome. And in mast cell activation syndrome, the mast cells are more fragile than they should be, and they burst open and release all of these immune chemicals, including histamine. So it's a little bit uncertain to me whether the best strategy is to avoid histamine or the best strategy is to try to avoid things that trigger mast cell degranulation. Um, I think some people who are super sensitive need to do both, at least temporarily, but to avoid so many foods, because histamine's in a lot of foods, including very healthy foods like fermented foods. Um, the same with the FODMAP diet. That's a diet that people use for irritable bowel syndrome. Very helpful in the short term, but if you stay on it for the long term, you're going to miss out on some really nutritious foods. So I'm big on, trying to give your body a bit of a break. And then with mast cell activation syndrome, most people who are experts feel it's being triggered by inflammation of some kind, like maybe there's inflammation through leaky gut, or maybe there's inflammation through viral molecules that are still in the body, or Lyme disease that hasn't been fully addressed, things like that, or toxins. I mean, we live in a toxic soup. Won't even get into that. So most people are saying probably it makes more sense. It's like higher up on the stream of causation to try to get rid of the chronic inflammation so that the mast cells aren't breaking open. And then maybe you could tolerate histamine containing foods. There's a lot of
Understood. Thank
layers to
you.
this. Yeah.
Thank you. I usually take a pause because I mute myself while you're speaking. Then I have to go find the button to unmute myself.
Got it.
Just one more quick question, and
Okay.
that is from Sean. So Sean says, I found methylene blue drops helped my chronic fatigue. Have you noticed or used or seen anybody using it?
I have to admit, I'm new to the methylene blue. I have not tried it myself and wasn't aware of it. Like I stopped working almost a year and a half ago with patients, but I've been listening to it and learning about it, and it sounds very interesting. The other thing that might be even safer and more powerful is hydrogen water. So I've actually just ordered myself a 3-month supply, and I'm going to be picking it up at a friend's in a couple days, and stay tuned. I'll see how it works, because at least hydrogen doesn't make you turn blue.
Understood. So I want to talk about methylene blue for a second.
Mm-hmm.
I've done a few talks about it. Methylene blue is interesting that it is actually a redox agent for both reduction and oxidation.
Yeah,
So
it's
when
fascinating.
methylene blue is taken, again the pharmaceutical grade, what it
Mm-hmm.
does is it goes in the mitochondria and it can help the complex 2 to donate electrons, which would have become reactive oxygen species, and it can help the complex 4 to acquire electrons from it. So if the electron transport chain isn't working correctly, methylene blue can actually help two components of it, while the near infrared actually helps mostly the complex 4. So
Yeah.
very interesting molecule to kickstart mitochondria, but there is a lot of studies that are coming up. People should be careful. This all is not a medical advice. Please talk with your doctors for any of those things. So
Great. Thank you.
you're very welcome. So with this, any commentary before we close? Anything that you would suggest for somebody? You had mentioned that age is not a factor. There are patients who may be even more than 70 and been suffering for decades and they feel better. Any
Mm-hmm.
commentary on that? So people who may be getting hopeless that
Yeah.
maybe we cannot have any benefit at advanced age. What do you think?
Yeah. So I was sick for 27 years before I, had a significant improvement. And so that really taught me through lived experience that it's never too late. I mean, I had given up, not about life in general, because I was still luckily able to do a few things, but I had given up that I would ever feel, exuberant and vital and filled with energy as I often do now. Um, Specifically, the comment about age was with regards to chronic pain, because what we know about chronic pain doesn't matter where it is in the body, where it's experienced in the body, it's actually generated by the brain. So I know we're right at the end, so very, very briefly, when we experience some kind of painful injury of some kind, sometimes the brain gets stuck. Just like I talked about before in the cell danger response, the cells get stuck in a low energy state. The brain gets stuck in a danger alarm state, and it keeps trying to warn us that there's a problem by generating pain and adrenaline and cortisol and all of these other things. And neuroplasticity based practice really works for that. It's a way of rewiring the brain. And I've had many, many patients who have had chronic pain for decades get considerably better.
Understood. Thank you very much. And while I'm going to be thanking you for your time, I also want to, in closing, once again, show your site. So
Thank you.
for the cool beans here, this is Dr. Stein's site. This is Eleanor Stein MD Canada pathways. So here are the pathways to improvement self-study course. Then there is a landing page with my name as well, with Dr. Bean's name as well. And just a disclaimer that I don't have any commercial interest, or there are no strings attached, but still there is a lot of information and helpful tips over here if you are in chronic fatigue syndrome like or long COVID like situation. So with this, Dr. Stein, thank you so much for joining us and for your insights. I would love to have you more often to talk more in the long COVID and maybe even vaccine side effects of a similar type in the future.
That would be great. And if I could just say, on my website, you might have seen it across the top, there's a tab called Free Resources. And on that tab, I have a ton of free resources, including lots of videos, so conversations like this that you can listen to, blogs, audio files, even recommended practitioners' publications, and resources that aren't me. So all the other organizations in the world that are doing great work that you could benefit from.
Awesome. Thank you very
Thanks.
much.
It was a
Thank you.
pleasure. Thank you so much.
Same here. Thank you very much. And Cool Beans, thank you very much for being here as well. Please look up Dr. Stein's work, and I would see you tomorrow.